Is this on? Yes. Okay. Good morning. Y'all ready to get started? Well, welcome to Silence is Not an Option. It's a monthly speaker series for August. My name is Sally King-Gilreath. And before we start this program, I have a few announcements about some upcoming events and just a brief introduction to what Silence is Not an Option, or SINO, is. We started about 16 months ago when a few women started talking about how dismayed, depressed, alarmed they were over what was going on in our country back at the beginning of 2025. Remember that feeling? Well, what started out as a small group of friends commiserating turned out to be almost 400 women showing up, and a few men showing up here at noon on a Wednesday in the middle of tourist season. Think about how hard it is to get parking and how much they needed community. There was so much energy in the room and nobody wanted to let it go, so we kept on meeting. So here we are 16 months later. We've done candidate forums for the U.S. Senate seat. We did a candidate forum for the 1st Congressional District. We presented on some of the hot topic items like health care, the environment. We had David Beasley speak to us about the food crisis. Jim Clyburn came and spoke. Had lots of different programs. So we now have over 1,600 followers on Facebook, over 5,000 on Blue Sky, and over 1,100 on Instagram. I can't even tell you how many are on the email list. So if you're not on the email list and would like to be, there's a sign-up sheet out in the lobby, or go to www.sino.chs.com. Don't forget the CHS or you end up with some Hong Kong organization. SINO is a nonpartisan grassroots organization or community created to unite, engage, inform, and empower all concerned citizens to take action in defense of democracy. We sponsor Second Sunday pop-up protests at various locations around town to get around that pesky little unconstitutional permit issue. Keep it under 25, 24's max, and you don't have to have a permit. We participate with several other groups in postcard writing parties here at Circular Church on the 2nd and 4th Sundays of the month. The postcards might be to get a get out the vote message, or to legislators on various issues like reining in the illegal activities of ICE. We also help promote the activities of other organizations, like the two we've partnered with today. We do meet and greets for candidates for both parties, author presentations, and other events that align with our mission. What we don't do is endorse candidates or promote fundraisers. And I don't know that we have any candidates here today. If we do, please stand. If we have any current or former elected officials. Okay. Some upcoming programs that y'all might be interested in. August 27th at 6:30 p.m., Buxton Books presents Lyndon Harris, The Future of Our Past, 25th anniversary of 9/11 and Challenges to Healing. On August 31st, the YWCA is presenting another Building Bridges workshop to help us build community by identifying and working through stereotypes and bias. This will be held at 135 West Richardson Avenue in Somerville from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And if anybody has any questions about it, Jan Anderson has done this workshop, what, twice or 3 times? Okay. In September, we plan to focus on election security and combat the misinformation that's being spread about election integrity. So even if you think you know that our elections are secure, which they are, please come and get that information so you can help spread the truth about how secure our elections are. There'll also be information about opportunities to volunteer at the polls and in other ways with the election. We're going to be working on a voter registration drive with the College of Charleston in September. Is that right, Lulu? Yeah. In October, we plan a TED Talk style program on the hot button issues that concern voters as they head to the polls. So come and get the straight facts on healthcare and the economy and things like that. Most of our programs are recorded. Thank you, Francis. And may be found on Circular Congregational Church's YouTube channel. And what I've been finding when I monitor it is that we have at least as many people watching us on the recording, and sometimes double and triple the number. So I think I counted about 36, 37 people here today. So by the time we get through with people tuning in later because they had a conflict this morning, we'll reach over 100 people. Today's program is co-sponsored by SINO, Buxton Books, and the League of Women Voters Charleston. The League of Women Voters has been providing nonpartisan civic education, voter services, and advocacy programs in the greater Charleston area for more than 75 years. And we have a number of League board members. If y'all could please stand. Kara, Jerry. Thank you so much, and please look into joining their group. Today's program is the first of a 4-part series. We'll be picking back up in January with part 2, when our guest speaker will be Jamila Gadsden, who is the executive director of the Emmanuel Nine Foundation. Jamila had planned to be with us this morning, but had a family emergency that's keeping her away. She's okay. Our guest speaker today is Kevin Sack, who is the author of Mother Emmanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. Polly Buxton, who is the co-owner or owner of Buxton Books, which is an independent bookstore on King Street in downtown Charleston, will be introducing our speaker in just a minute. And if you picked up a note card back at the table, if you have a question for Mr. Sack, if you'll please write it down, and we'll be picking those up towards the end of the program so he can answer them. Polly, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome. I am Polly of Buxton Books. My husband Julian and I have had the privilege of being booksellers at our independent bookstore here in our hometown for over 10 years now. And it's just such an honor to be the booksellers tonight, but also to serve you in this community. Thank you to SINO and the League of Women Voters for bringing us together and for your continued commitment to an informed and engaged community. We share those values and just honor and thank you. Today we're gathering around a book of extraordinary depth and consequence. Mother Emmanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. Before I introduce Kevin, I want to acknowledge with particular respect that this is a history of local and national significance, but it's also the history of a living church, a living congregation, and a Charleston community for whom the events recounted in these pages are deeply personal. We hold that truth and the complexity of this conversation with great care. Kevin Sack is a veteran journalist who has spent more than 4 decades reporting on American life. During 30 years at the New York Times, where he served as a senior writer, and in his earlier work for the Los Angeles Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, he shared in 3 Pulitzer Prizes. This past spring, he taught at Princeton University as a visiting lecturer and Ferris Professor. For Mother Emmanuel, Kevin spent nearly a decade researching, listening, interviewing, and writing, drawing upon an extraordinary range of primary sources, scholarship, and conversations with congregants, historians, and theologians. He traces more than 200 years of Black faith, resistance, leadership, survival, and achievement through the story of one of America's most consequential churches. The massacre of June 17th, 2015 is part of this history. But the book makes clear that it is not the whole of it. Mother Emanuel reaches back to the church's founding and follows the generations who built, sustained, and continually renewed it. And it examines forgiveness not as a simple or sentimental response, but as something spiritually profound and inseparable from the continuing demands of truth and justice. And I know those are the values of SINO that brought us together. The recognition this book has received is remarkable. Mother Emanuel was named one of the 10 best books of 2025 by the New York Times Book Review, and a Best Book of the Year by NPR and Kirkus Reviews. It received the Willie Morris Award for Southern Writing and was a finalist for both the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the 2026 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction. The Pulitzer Prize citation praised it as a sensitive exploration and a rigorously researched account of faith, African American institutions, the legacy of slavery, and what remains after devastating loss. David Blight called it both a modern psalm and a testimony, a work of scholarship and a cry in the night. And Randall Kennedy, writing in the New York Times, described it as a masterpiece and a singular journalistic achievement. Kevin is a native of Jacksonville and a graduate of Duke University. He lives here in Charleston with his wife, Dina, and serves on the board of the Mother Emanuel Memorial Foundation. Kevin is also our friend. We have witnessed something of the rigor, humility, and deep sense of responsibility that he brought to this work. It is a privilege to welcome him today and to honor a book that asks us not only to remember, but to look more closely, listen more carefully, and understand more fully. If you have not done so yet, I encourage you to read this book. I've read it twice. We have signed hardcover and paperback copies for sale in the back following the program. It's also available at your libraries. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Sack.
Hello, everybody. Polly, that was just beautiful and moving and touching. The last time I felt this way, I think, was the last time I parred a hole on the golf course. I just want to go home, and even like the third hole, you just want to say, "All right, I'm done. We're good. We're good here. I'm good for the day." That was lovely. Makes me want to go read the book. So I think maybe I just will. It's such a privilege to be with everybody here, and thanks to SINO and to the League and to Buxton Books for the invitation. It's a total privilege to be with all of you. I've got what I guess our kids would call mad respect for what you guys do. I've been following your work both through several friends that I've got who are members of the organization. I've been impressed by the media coverage that I've seen, and just, before I get started talking about Mother Emanuel, just a real tip of the hat to all of you for the important work that you're doing, and I hope you know that it's being noticed, that it is seen out on the streets. People are aware of what you're doing, and keep at it. You are our resistance right now. And I guess that sort of provides a segue into talking about the book. The subtitle of the book has 3 key words: race, resistance, and forgiveness. And I thought we'd talk about the middle one a little bit more than some of the others today. Because I think that within the story of this church, which is not only the story of the church, but also the story of African American life in this town over more than 2 centuries, and also the story of the African American church writ large. There's a real pattern in history of resistance that should inspire you guys, that should set precedent for you guys. And I would think you would find some comfort in knowing that the very type of resistance that you're practicing so beautifully now has deep roots in this town. And that's a surprise to some people, because Charleston has something of a reputation of not really being a resistance city. I certainly found that as I was doing my research. And I think the story of the church demonstrates that that's a real misunderstanding of the people here and their persistence, really, in standing up to injustice, mistreatment, discrimination. As Polly said, the jumping off point for this book, obviously, were the events of June 17th, 2015, which I covered for the New York Times, covered the aftermath for the New York Times. I came over a couple of days afterwards. I spent the first week writing a long profile of Reverend Pinckney that ran on the front page of the paper the morning of his remarkable memorial service at TD Arena. I then covered that service and co-wrote our story that, again, ran on the front page that day. So I was blessed to be in the room as President Obama eulogized the 9 and sang. And when I came out of that service, the thinking that had already been developing over the prior 10 days about there being a much bigger story in this event and in this church than just the horrific tragedy of that night, it was really starting to gel. And if you go back and watch his eulogy, he spent a lot of time speaking about the role of the black church, the place of the black church in the resistance movement, in the social justice movement. And while clearly, as I said, the shootings of that night, the horrible murders in the fellowship hall, were going to be my jumping off point, and while I was deeply, profoundly moved in real time by those events, both as a Southerner and as a journalist who had spent most of his career in the South, what really grabbed me, what really shook me and said, this is a story that you need to follow on an ongoing basis, was the amazing history of Mother Emanuel, which I started to get a feel for that very night. I had never heard of the place when I started seeing the first reports on CNN about a shooting with mass casualties at a church in downtown Charleston. And I started Googling the church, and up popped these snippets of history, right? That it was the oldest AME church in the South. That it had been formed around 1818 after almost an unthinkably subversive walkout by African American Methodists from white Methodist churches. That it had been associated with the Denmark-Vesey insurrection of 1822, destroyed as a result, had an amazing history during Reconstruction, and maybe an even more amazing history during the Civil Rights Movement. And I started to, as I started to study just the skeletal bits of that history, it occurred to me that you could use the church as a vehicle to tell this broader, longer story of African American life in this town, over an extended period. And I thought that that had narrative and historical value for a couple of reasons. One, that it was Charleston. This wasn't just any other place. This was the place that was more central to the slave trade than any other in America. 46% of all enslaved Africans who disembarked in North America did so in the port just down the road. And of course, the Civil War, we know, began at Fort Sumter. So it seemed to me that there was no place in America more central to our understanding of our racial history, of our racial divide, than Charleston. And the other thing that struck me as being a huge advantage in this story was the age of the church, that it had been around for a full 2 centuries. And so, unlike a lot of our history, which may focus on a single individual, a year, an event, a war, a decade, right? This story, the story of this congregation, gave me the ability to sort of show the connectedness of all those dots, to show how one era leads to the next, leads to the next. And in the case of this place, and I think this is what makes it relevant to our current day, it certainly shows what I would call the action-reaction pattern of American racial history, right? Progress followed by blowback, followed by more incremental progress, followed by blowback. That's the story of Emmanuel, leading all the way up to 2015. So let's walk through it a little bit. Because I just think it's also interesting, and I do think it really places current day in context a bit. You know, Charleston was a majority black city when Emmanuel was formed in the second decade of the 1800s, the 19th century. It was most of those folks obviously were enslaved, but nonetheless a majority black city. There also was a sizable free black population here. Those folks had become free in any variety of ways, but it was a large enough community that it was, to some extent, a distinct community. It operated in almost sort of a legal netherworld between the rightless enslaved folks and the aristocrats who ran the city, the white aristocrats who ran the city. And religion from the get-go, Christianity, was obviously a controversial matter in terms of the enslaved in Charleston. On the one hand, preachers of the gospel felt scripturally called to broadcast the word, right? Despite their degraded state, there was no sense that slaves were not people, were without souls, and therefore there was a spiritual obligation to tend to those souls. At the same time, the argument that the white pastorate made was that religion would have a palliative effect. We've all heard this, right? Opiate of the masses, said Marx. And so, religion could be used, Christianity could be used to control, both psychologically and physically. On the other hand, of course, there's a lot in Scripture about freedom, about justice. There's some values that don't really jibe too well with enslavement. And that was understood quite well, too. And slave owners were very skeptical about the church in a city like this. Again, given the numbers. They had every reason to fear the possibility of a revolt because of the numbers. And so enslaved people were taken to church by their owners, to the churches typically of the owner's choice, but not always. And Methodism, once it arrived in the States, had great appeal to the enslaved and to free blacks because it began as an abolitionist faith. John and Charles Wesley had spent time in Savannah and in Charleston, had experienced the horrors of slavery. They write about it in great detail in their diaries. When they went back to England and started to formulate this breakaway denomination, breakaway obviously from the Anglican Church, that took a strictly abolitionist stance. And when their lieutenants started to bring, like Asbury, started to bring the faith back across the Atlantic, that really took hold. So Methodism was hugely popular in Charleston among African Americans, and for exactly the same reason, hugely unpopular among whites in town. And there were Methodist churches that had memberships that were almost exclusively black. And because of that, because of the difficulties of sort of managing large numbers of enslaved by small numbers of white folks, gradually there were sort of rights granted to these congregations, the black congregants. They were able to take up their own collections. To some extent, they were able to spend their own collections. Word started to spread that some of this money was being used to buy enslaved people out of enslavement, that it was being used to manumit enslaved folks. At some point around 1816, a new Methodist minister in charge, white minister in charge, arrives in Charleston, gets concerned about all this and starts withdrawing some of these privileges. And the straw that breaks the camel's back is when a plan is announced to build a garage for a horse-drawn hearse on top of a black burial ground next to the church. This incites what I described before as a sort of unthinkably subversive walkout, literally by thousands of African American Methodists in this town from white Methodist churches. And they very quick, that was in 1817. By the next year, they've purchased a piece of property, not on Calhoun Street where the church is now, but up in the neck at the corner of Hanover and Reed Street, if you can picture where that is. And they build a physical building, wood frame building. They have services. The church immediately comes under harassment from white officials. You can imagine the threat that they perceived in this place. You know, who are these people? Who do they think they are, creating their own religious institution where we cannot watch them? You know, among the reasons that enslavers took their enslaved to church was to keep an eye on them. There was even a law at one point in Charleston that men were required to bear arms in church on Sundays because the fear was that that the enslaved would sort of use Sunday mornings as a time to organize and meet and plot an insurrection. So the church undergoes this kind of harassment from the get-go. There are arrests made, services are broken up. It's a little bit hard to tell from the record how much the church actually is actively used during its early years because it's under such relentless attack. And then in 1822, we all know what happens, the Vesey insurrection plot is uncovered. And among the more interesting things I discovered in the book was the close relationship between those who were arrested in that plot and hung. Ultimately, 35 people were hung, including, including Vesey himself. Close association between those folks and the church. Fully half of those who were sent to the gallows were members of the church. And when you look at the record, everybody is asked, were you a member? Was he a witness? You know, the witnesses are asked, was he a member of the church? It's almost as if the church itself is being prosecuted as much as the individuals who were hauled in off the streets. My studies show that if you were a member of the church, you were twice as likely to be charged, or I guess not charged, twice as likely to be convicted and sentenced to death as those who were not members of the church. And as a result of that association, the church is destroyed in the immediate aftermath. The trials take place in July and August of 1822. in August of 1822, we see ads in Charleston newspapers advertising the sale of all the lumber from what was then called the African church. It was not a manual at this point. Church is destroyed. The urban legend for generations has been that it was burned to the ground in this very dramatic conflagration. These ads demonstrate that that's not the case. The lumber survived, so it could not have been burned to the ground. And we don't know exactly how that happened, but my vision of it is that it may have been even more dramatic than this notion of a fire, because I can envision a situation in which the church fathers sort of negotiated with the city. Yes, we understand you've got to destroy the church, but can we not burn it? Can we take it apart so that we can at least sell the lumber and have that silver lining? And I can envision the people that built the church with their own hands now taking it apart, nail by nail. Had to be an incredibly heartbreaking experience, I would think. So again, we see, this sort of assertion of rights by the enslaved community, the black community here, followed by this really harsh crackdown. This was followed, for over the next 40 years, really until the Civil War, one piece of harsh legislation after the next, both from in the city and in the state, that denied particularly free people of color of their rights. And there wasn't much more you could do to deny the enslaved of theirs, but there was a huge crackdown on free people of color. Morris Brown, who had led the walkout in 1817 from the mainline Methodist churches and became the preacher at the African church, the lead preacher at the African church. All of you know Morris Brown AME Church. That's named after him, as is Morris Brown College. But he was a shoemaker who was also a lay preacher. And as a result of the VZ insurrection, he and others are exiled. They wind up in Philadelphia. So the church's operations really are shut down. And the church essentially remains underground, as far as we know, until the end of the Civil War, at which point there are AME missionaries who have been positioned in Port Royal, south of here, who follow Union troops directly into the city as the war ends. A little quick history on Port Royal. Civil War buffs will know that that area was taken by Union forces early in the war and used as sort of a staging ground for the blockade of Charleston Harbor and raids on plantations, on the Combie, for instance, if you know Etta Fields Black's recent book on Harriet Tubman and those raids. That was all happening in the Port Royal area. It was under Union control. And so at some point, the Army and nonprofit groups got AME ministers to come down to that area to serve the spiritual needs of newly emancipated slaves in that area who had been freed from the plantations. So they were positioned just, a short jump away as soon as these Union forces came into Charleston to follow them and establish a church beachhead here. And there was immediately a competition among various denominations. I call it a spiritual land rush in the book, for these, thousands of churchless folks, not to mention their tithes, right? And because of the legacy that the AME church already had here from the African church, which was, I neglected to say this, it had affiliated directly with the AME denomination, which had just formed in Philadelphia a year earlier. So it was very much, even though it was not called an AME church at the time, it was very much part of the AME affiliation. Anyway, because of the previous history in Charleston, that church sort of easily wins this competition. And African Methodism quickly becomes the single largest Protestant denomination anywhere on the peninsula, and remains that way for a good while. And the first pastor who comes down to lead the church at this point is Richard Harvey Kane. He's brought in from Brooklyn, an incredibly entrepreneurial guy who not only starts to build a building on the current site at 110 Calhoun Street, not the building that's there now, but a predecessor wood frame building. Builds that building. He's an amazing fundraiser, but he also sees the church as his pulpit really as a springboard into other areas. He uses it as a springboard into publishing, other types of business, and politics. Runs for the state house and wins, and eventually becomes one of the 16 African American Republicans elected to Congress during Reconstruction. All starting with his role at the head of Mother Emanuel. He names the church Emmanuel at this point, which means God with us, and God be with us. And his life, as I depicted in the book, really is, thank you, really is illustrative, almost representative of the whole Reconstruction story, because it starts with this amazing ambition and promise and sort of ends in crushing disappointment. He loses his position in Congress at the end of Reconstruction, retreats back into the comfort of the church, and then, a very dark period for the church, as for all of African American society in the South, begins as Jim Crow takes hold. And during those years, the church is, it's an oasis. It's the one place that folks can go and feel respect, feel purpose, exhibit their talents and their skills and their abilities, hold leadership positions. It's all of that. It is unquestionably not just this black church, but every black church, the most important single institution for African Americans in the Jim Crow South, all the way through the 60s and 70s, I would argue. The last bit of the history that I'll sort of skim over is the Civil Rights era, when the pastor of the church is a man named Benjamin J. Glover. He serves from 1953 to 65. He's the longest serving pastor in the history of the church. Reverend Manning is creeping up on him. He's at 10 or 11 years now, I think. And Glover had a really interesting history as a young man. There are stories in the book about him being severely beaten by Ersatz Klansmen because of his efforts to register to vote in the upstate at a time when the upstate wasn't quite ready for that. And for a while had an enormous resentment of white people, which he got past to some extent, but held on to the anger enough that he was really one of Charleston's most visible civil rights leaders during the movement. And he was simultaneously the pastor of the church and the president of the Charleston branch of the NAACP. Interestingly, his daughter Ovida is now the president of the Columbia branch. I think I'm right. She may be the president of the state NAACP, one of the two. Glover led marches from the steps, held mass meetings with NAACP national leaders in the sanctuary. he made that church a movement church. It wasn't the only movement church in town. There were others. But Emmanuel was certainly recognized as the center of that activity, particularly during some very hot summers of 1962, 1963, when he was leading demonstrations against discrimination and segregation at stores on King Street, movie theaters, restaurants, the various hotels in town, things like that. And my favorite story about Glover, talk about resistance, is that they lived in the parsonage. The church had a parsonage on Rutledge, and there was a segregated white laundromat just a block or two down the street, which they could not go to. And so instead, they would have to haul their heavy loads of laundry, he and his wife, blocks and blocks away to a segregated black laundromat that was, it must be said, of lesser condition. Just wasn't as nice as the white one that was closer. And he finally decided he had had enough of this one day. He tells his wife, put the linens, the towels, the sheets, put all of that in a pillowcase and give it to me. So she does, throws it over his back. He walks into the white laundromat like he owns the place. There are people in there. He starts getting stares. He walks right up to a machine, starts loading the stuff into the tumbler and feeding coins into the slots. You can hear the rumbling going on, and, doesn't take long for the manager to come over and say, you can't be doing that. That's against the rules. And he sort of pauses and says, but wait a minute, I don't know how I'm breaking the rules. The sign right there says whites only. And he sort of doubles down, he opens up the tumbler, he goes, whites only. That's all I got. And the end of the story is that the manager calls the cops, as one would do in the day. And an officer comes and, sort of gets his understanding of the situation and eventually tells the manager, she just says, look, just leave that. He uses the N-word. Use that N-word preacher alone. Just let him be. And because of that, the place essentially desegregates, because Glover goes back and starts telling his friends, I got this done, follow me up, and they did, and the place desegregated pretty quickly after that. So he was a remarkable figure. His daughter, Ovida, was among the first to desegregate Charleston schools. There was a lot of tension within the congregation about his civil rights activities because he didn't ask permission. And you'll remember the era, this is when 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed, and those 4 little girls were killed on a Sunday morning while primping in the bathroom for Sunday school. So there was a real reason for the congregants of this church, whose children were there, whose family members were there at services, and who had invested their time and their toil and their dollars into this place, to be concerned. So there are letters that I quote in the book to Glover from congregants warning him to back off, moving too fast and too hard. So anyway, that's sort of I was going to say quick, probably not so quick, survey of some of the history of the place. And again, I hope you see in that there is this recurring theme of resistance and of fighting back and of not putting up with the status quo. And I certainly think that's what the place has been about since the shootings as well. Let me talk real quickly about a couple other components of that. The other, significant part of this story, obviously, is what I will shorthand by calling the forgiveness narrative. We all remember what happened in the days immediately following these shootings. What you may not remember is that it really started the very day after, the night after. We all, I think, remember the bond hearing across the street in state court. The night before, there had been a memorial service at Goose Creek High School for Sharonda Singleton, who was one of the victims. She had taught there and coached there. Her son, Chris, who some of you may have gotten to know, remarkable young man, incredibly poised. He and his sister, Cameron, walk out, and a TV reporter shoves a mic in their face and says, "What are you feeling right now?" And Chris says, without any thought, right now, there's nothing but love from our side of the family. We've already forgiven him for what he's done. It's the next day, next afternoon, when the shooter has been extradited from North Carolina, where he's been captured. He has his first appearance, bond hearing in state court. Family members of the victims are invited to attend. None of them are told in advance that they're going to be offered a chance to speak. And certainly none of them know that this is going to be televised live globally, which it was. But when the judge does offer them that opportunity, 5 of them, one after the next, troop up to a microphone like this one and offer this, utterly remorseless, unrepentant, white supremacist, mass murderer, some degree of forgiveness. They say slightly different things if you look at their exact words, but their intent is all the same. And of course, I think, like anybody who was watching that in real time, as I was sort of simultaneously awestruck and dumbfounded, right? Maybe the purest expression of Christianity I had ever seen, and at the same time, not sure I could ever see myself doing the same thing or really understand how they had brought themselves to do it under these circumstances. And that, along with my fascination with the history of the place before that night, is really what drove the exploration that led to the book, because I wanted to find out where that had come from, and eventually decided that if I was going to find an answer to that question, it was going to be in the very history of the church and of the denomination, that I needed to go back and study what these folks had been through in the past that enabled that. And what I concluded is that, look, we all know that, forgiveness has deep, foundational, a foundational role in Scripture, right? There's perhaps no verse more important than, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Forgive us our trespasses. I think it's Peter that goes to Jesus and asks whether he has to continue to forgive an offender even after the 7th offense, right? And Jesus' response is 70 times 7. So it's there. And everyone that sits in pews like these on Sundays and Wednesdays absorbs that to a certain extent, maybe to a profound extent. But what I concluded after talking to all of those who forgave, as well as lots of folks who didn't and couldn't, ministers of various faiths, theologians, what I concluded was that forgiveness takes a distinct role, an additional role in the Black church. And that it's not, in those of us who may have interpreted what was said that day in court, that forgiveness expressed toward Dylann Roof as being for Dylann Roof, probably misunderstand what the place of forgiveness in the history of Black Christianity and the place of grace in that history. And when I talked to these folks, they explained that, it wasn't for him, it was for me. The forgiveness was for me. It was almost a psychological survival mechanism that these folks utilized, and that I argue in the book that the Black church has utilized over the centuries as a way to get through, as a way to get by. And when you think about sort of the catalog of injustices and mistreatment that, to some extent, this book is, the catalog of that mistreatment over history, you start to think, well, yeah, how else would you get through? Felicia Sanders, who all of you probably know or have heard of, one of the survivors, and who lost a son and an aunt, said, yeah, that's, it's sort of the only way I get out of bed in the morning, is to forgive. And Anthony Thompson, whose wife Myra was leading the Bible study that night, told me in an interview that what forgiveness had done for him was it meant that he no longer needed to make a lifetime partner of this guy. He could put it in the rearview mirror. And so these folks were really saying, you did a lot of damage. You've taken my loved one, you've destroyed our community to some extent, but it ends there. You're not taking from me my ability to live out the rest of my life with some sense of purpose and mission and maybe even a little joy. It was almost a declaration of resistance in its own way, I think, and a reclamation of agency, right? Victimhood, by definition, takes away agency. And I think these folks were saying, the one thing you cannot take away from me is my ability to forgive. I've got that. Nothing you can do about it. I'll close on this. I talked about the incredible respect I've got for the various forms of resistance that you guys are showing. My own form has really been in talking about the book at events like this, and in doing so, emphasizing the fact that I hope readers will see it and books like it, and there are lots of wonderful books like it, as antidotes to the assault that we're seeing both from Washington and various state capitals on actual American history. I maintain that this is real, fully told, nuanced American history that we all need to know. And these efforts that we're seeing to diminish it, to whitewash it, which is exactly the right word, it just should be beneath us. And it's silly, and it's juvenile, and it's petty, and sort of ridiculous, and clearly being done for a purely political purpose. And I certainly feel that it's only once we as a nation can start to accept and acknowledge this history as our shared history, as all of our history. And it doesn't matter where we came from or how long we've been here or who our people were, how they comported themselves once they got here. My people came long after the Revolution and the Civil War. That's still my history. And this is too. I wasn't here for it necessarily, I wasn't involved in it, but it nonetheless is my history. And it's only, I think, once we accept that we're going to be able to move in any way towards a more just and equitable country if we decide that's what we want again. And thankfully, that is what all of you want again. So with that, I'll take any questions you guys have.
Any thoughts about the future of this church?
Lots. So as Polly explained, I'm a brand new member of the board of the Mother Emanuel Memorial Foundation, which is building the memorial right next to the church, which we are hopeful will open this fall. The church is in an interesting place, and it takes a little bit of explanation to talk about it, and I know you guys will get into it more in your future sessions too. So it was, I think a lot of people don't realize it was a church in decline at the time this happened. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, a church that had once had thousands of members was down to 500 or 600 or so. and Sunday worship might draw 100, maybe sometimes. Congregation was quite old. It was on the stodgy side, even as AME churches go. It has a real sense of itself and its historical place, and so, you know, still a lot of fine hats and nice suits on Sunday mornings, and there's no electric guitar. As a result, there's not a lot to attract young families sometimes, and so they've struggled. The pastor hates to when I say this, but they have in fact struggled to bring in new members, although he certainly is bringing in some, and some young members, but it's tough. It's also a very socially conservative place. This fascinates me about the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, but even though it was born as a liberation church in the early 1800s, it's very socially conservative, and particularly as it pertains to LGBTQ issues. So, for instance, same-sex marriages are prohibited within the denomination. And in my 10 years of hanging around the church, I didn't find a single out member, which isn't to say that there aren't folks there, obviously, but no one really feels comfortable expressing themselves that way. So all of that goes to say that it was already tough to get, to grow the place. Then you've got, 9 congregants, including 3 ministers killed in cold blood, 1 floor below the sanctuary. A lot of people just weren't comfortable coming back, including some family members for obvious reasons. So that put more pressure on it. Church is very old as a building. It was built in the 1890s, the current structure. It's got real physical needs. Termites and water had done terrible damage to the trusses. They're in the middle of a 2-phase campaign to try to raise the money they need to do that repair work. So, all of this goes to say that it's got sort of, a static to declining membership and increasing capital needs. It's about, I think, to sort of get back on the national radar when this memorial opens. I think it will become a significant stop for visitors to our town. It's quite beautiful, and designed, if you don't know, by Michael O'Rod, who's the architect for the 9/11 Memorial in New York. One challenge that the place has that other downtown churches don't have, the African American churches in downtown Charleston all face this same problem because of gentrification. The population has moved far out. Emmanuel used to be a neighborhood church where everybody walked to church. That no longer is the case. It's almost impossible for anyone to walk to church. And so that's made it tough too. Some of these other churches have an option. They can leave, right? Sell the building, go out to the suburbs where their population is in Somerville or North Charleston or whatever. Emmanuel can't do that because it's now not only an active church, but it's a shrine. It's literally on the National Register. But even beyond that, it is sacred ground for the denomination and for that congregation. And so the congregation is going to have to find ways to keep this place viable under some pretty tough pressures. Would you agree, Margaret?
Would I agree?
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that Mother Emanuel is declining rapidly, and that 75% of the people who show up there for service on Sunday are visitors.
Yeah. Maybe not quite that high, but yes,
It's pretty close.
There's a sizable proportion of every Sunday's worshipers are visitors, many of them white, and that changes the dynamic of the place. And there are some, and there's sort of a divide in the church about that. Some folks think this is great, we need obviously fresh faces in this place. We need money in this place. They bring that. Some of them actually see this as the sort of the silver lining in the whole thing, that maybe this was God's purpose, that it's bringing new people into the church that otherwise wouldn't have been here. But there are also just a lot of folks who kind of want their old Emmanuel back and are resistant to the notion that they're never going to be able to quite get it back. It's never going to be the family church that it used to be.
So Kevin, talk a little bit about the programming that's going to happen once the memorial opens, that the church is going to do, because I think that this is Mother Emanuel's best chance not only to thrive financially, I think it is the best chance to make a difference for the future of all of us.
So the memorial really has two components, a physical component and then a programming component. The physical component, which you can go online and look at the mock-ups if you want to, and again, within a few months, hopefully you'll be able to walk past and visit and see the real thing. But it's centered with two sort of long arcing benches made out of this beautiful white marble, and centered within it is a memorial fountain with the names of each of the victims, of the 9 victims. Behind it, there's sort of a reflection area. And then the second phase, which has not been started yet, but I think is mostly funded, and hopefully will start before too long, is on the other side of the church. It's going to be a survivor's garden. And I really like what the symbolism of what they've done. There are going to be 6 benches around this garden. There were 5 survivors, 3 adults and 2 children. So 1 bench is for each of them. That leaves 1 unaccounted for. It represents the church itself, which is the ultimate survivor. I kind of like that. The programming component, which is being led up by Pastor Manning, hopes to, use the event and use the memorial itself as an impetus for deep thinking and conversation about the very issues we've been talking about today, about racism, about forgiveness, about justice, all of those themes. And he has been constructing a curriculum that will be used online by visiting groups. I think there are plans for sort of extended courses using this curriculum. Folks that will come to town or folks who are already in town will come to the site and meet there to discuss it, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's a lot of hope that it will kind of renew the focus on the place.
If I can add, there's one other new organization that I'm going to bring up. It's called the Emmanuel 9 Foundation that is being formed now by one of the niece of one of the people that was killed. And she is going to, through the church, well, it's not affiliated with the church, but it's the Emmanuel 9 Foundation, and she is a member of the church, is going to be focusing on youth and youth leadership and more of a community focus, whereas 2 of the 3 foundations that Kevin has mentioned are more on bricks and mortar. This is more community related. And we are fortunate to have Jamila, and we haven't finished organizing the details yet, but in our January meeting will be Jamila here with community members talking about what her vision is for that. So I invite you all back for that. Is that a good ending?
Yeah, I will just add, I think that it's really extraordinary that SINO has decided to invite our community. So I hope that those of you who are here, I think this is an incredible starting off point, is to read the history. I am from here and for generations, and I did not know this history, and it is essential history. It is our history as not only as Charlestonians, but as humans. We need to know this history. So I just implore you to read it and to invite people to come back for part 2 and part 3 and 4, and to get involved. I mean, this is giving so much honor to the actual congregants of Mother Emanuel. This is our community, this is our church. We are responsible, and we need to get involved. We need to be informed, and we need to support as respectfully and as best we can. And I just think this is extraordinary. Each one of you who chose to be here, I think it is, when you show up at these events, when you buy a book or read a book, when you start a conversation with someone, that's an extraordinary act of defiance and resistance, and it's essential that we do it. So thank you all for choosing to be here and for showing up. I'm going to tell you, switch gears real quick and tell you about Jill Lepore. Some of you know her. She won the Pulitzer Prize, the same one that you were a finalist for. But
Actually not. Different category.
Different category.
Different category.
But
So
Jill,
I got nothing against her.
That's good, because you're going to be in conversation with her. So Kevin Sack is going to be in conversation with Jill Lepore at the Gill Yard the day after Labor Day, so it's a tough day for some people, but please look into it, consider coming. It is about democracy and AI, and it is pretty fascinating and also very important, not to take anything away from our conversation today, which is just so beautiful. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, SINO, and to the League of Women Voters, and thank you to each one of you. Kevin is going to be personalizing books in the back, but they're also just signed copies if you want to come say hello, and please continue the conversation.